I was introducing the lesson last week on musical worship in the church, and we were discussing the practices found in the Old Testament. And I believe that's a good place to start because we want to try to understand what God's view on music is. And I've always said that, before we even get into the issue of whether or not we're going to determine the use of instrumental music or a cappella, you got to find out first if God even wants music in his worship, right? I think that would be a legitimate thing to do, to say, well, okay, we're discussing which kind of music, but hey, did God even want, music? It'd be like you guys arguing what color dress I wanted to wear without even asking if I was going to wear a dress. We've been going back to the Old Testament and even prior to the law of Moses, going prior to that. And we're going to look at what we see in regards to music in worship. And then we're going to focus primarily on the temple worship itself and where we see instruments actually being introduced into what would be considered a corporate worship or public worship of God's people when they would come together. So, in going back to 2 Chronicles chapter 29, 2 Chronicles 29, beginning in verse 26, says, the Levites stood with the musical instruments of David and the priest and with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah gave the order to offer the burnt offering on the altar. When the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord also began with the trumpets, accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. While the whole assembly worshiped, the singers also sang, and the trumpets sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. Right? So, in this passage right here, we're having an introduction of music being used in this temple worship. And it's temple worship, keep that in mind. And there's a couple of things you want to note here, the phrasing of this. So, when you read what takes place at the offering, right? In verse 25, and we didn't read that verse, but let's just jump back to 25. And then they stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with harps, and with lyres, according to the command of David and of Gad the king's seer and of Nathan the prophet, for the command was from the Lord through his prophets. Now, there's debate on that passage on whether or not the statement, the command was from the Lord through his prophets, is either referring to the fact that the Levites were supposed to assemble there and prepare for the worship, or if that attaches itself to what they were doing as well. I tend to believe that since that's at the bottom of this whole statement here, that it's applying to the whole of the statement. So the statement is, they stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and harps and lyres according to the command of David, right? That's the command of David. And of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet. So there's this command that's given, according to this passage, by David and Gad and Nathan the prophet. But then it says, for the command was from the Lord through his prophets. So it's as if there were two commands. One was the command to use these instruments that they're going to use, and that command came from David, from Gad, and from Nathan. And Nathan's a prophet, and Gad is a seer, so similar. And David is the one who actually wanted these things done. But then that last part of it says, for the command was from the Lord through his prophets. So it seems that God was approving of what they were going to do in the use of the instrument here. Now, again, there are those who will argue, well, it doesn't apply to that. It just applies to the fact that they'd come together for worship. I don't see that because there's too much before it that seems to indicate that these things were already a command by these three individuals, and David is the Lord's king. He's the one that was put in by Samuel, right? And then Nathan, he's the one that comes to David and tells David about his sin against Bathsheba. So Nathan is a prophet of God. We know that he's a prophet of God. And Gad is a seer. So there seems to be at least this connection that these individuals were not just making this decision up on their own.
Yeah, and the context, I mean, I don't know how you can interpret it any other way. The context very clearly talks about the cymbals, the harps, and the lyre. So how could you separate that out from the command of the Lord?
Right.
Not me.
Exactly. And I don't, exactly, but there are some who will argue that. I don't know, and I haven't heard it from a grammatical standpoint. I think sometimes, and this is the argument I'm bringing is an argument that has come from people in the church who just absolutely say that there was never a time when God ever allowed instrumental music in worship. They hold to that view that he never allowed it. And so the times that you read about in the Old Testament have to be acts of disobedience. Whenever they use the instrument in worship, it was an act of disobedience. The problem is that none of those acts are ever stated to be such. When you go back and you read when they're doing this, like for example this is never an act that's condemned. Right? If this was something that was going to be disapproved by God, we would think that somewhere in there it should have been mentioned that this was disapproved by God. And when you go back and even look at David wanting to build the temple, remember David had his plans, right? But what did God tell David about the temple when he was going to build it? Yeah, he's like, one, I didn't ask you for, but if you are going to build it, I'm going to tell you how to build it, right? So if God is telling David how to build it, God is interjecting that I'm not just going to let you do whatever you want and go, okay, it's perfectly fine if you want to use the instrument. He's even telling David, if you're going to build a temple, I didn't ask for one, but if you're going to build one, this is the way you're going to do it. So here it would seem that if this was something God did not approve of, that certainly a statement would be there indicating God didn't approve them of using those instruments. Now, one of the things though that I want to bring in is that it doesn't appear that the use of the instrument in worship was God's idea. And I know that's kind of God's idea. It doesn't seem like it was God's idea. The way it's worded, it tends to put it over on David, right? So it begins with, according to the command of David. So he's the first one. But if you keep reading down through here, verse 27, verse 26, the Levites stood with the musical instruments of David. Verse 27, then Hezekiah gave the order to offer the burnt offering on the altar. When the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord also began with the trumpets, accompanied by the instruments of David, the king of Israel. So 2 times following that, it seems to point towards that this was something David had desired, and God allowed it, but it wasn't something that God said, hey, I want you to use instruments in worship. And I think one of the ways you can argue in support of that view is to go back and look at the tabernacle, right? And if you go back and look at the tabernacle worship, which was prior to temple worship, the tabernacle was nobody's idea. It was God's command to the people. And when he commanded them to do the tabernacle, did they use the harps, the lyre, the trumpet? I mean, there was a trumpet, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But none of those instruments were ever included in tabernacle. So when God instructed them in tabernacle worship, he never instructed any type of mechanical musical worship to be offered. So when we get to the temple, that not being God's plan, that being David's plan, and then although God said, okay, if you're going to do it this way, I think it would be logical to conclude that David, being a musician, player of the harp, would have himself thought that this was a good thing to include. Well, how could you suppose that? By the mere fact that David even wanted to build a temple, he thought that was a good idea. And remember his argument with the tabernacle, why he didn't think that they should keep the tabernacle? Because they said, look, we're living in our cedar homes, and the Ark of the Covenant is under a tent. So David kind of viewed what God had built, what God had told them to build, his design, as to be inferior. It wasn't enough to hold the glory of God and all he represented. So God said, well, that's what I commanded you to build, or at least Moses at the time when it was built, and has been with him this whole time. So David already shows that he thinks there's something else that should be built for God's worship, a temple. Well, if he's already got that mindset, I don't think it's a far stretch to think that he also supposed that using the instrument in worship would be a good idea as well. You know, I mean, why not bring music into the worship?
But he didn't want, is that, you're talking about the temple or the one David said the house of the Lord? He was gonna build him a house, and then he said, he didn't want David to build it because of his killings
Right.
and all his murderings and whatever he did.
Right, the blood on his hands, yeah.
He allowed Solomon.
Yes. That's what we're talking about. That's the temple. Because David's the one who designed it. David's the one that wanted to do it. Now, David didn't build it, right? Who's the one that eventually builds it? Solomon builds it. He tells him he can't. But God allows him. But David had already started off with, I want to do this. He'd already put the plans into action, right? In his own mind, and had already designed what, and God said, okay, you're going to do it this way. So going back and reading here, the passages is referring to David, the instruments of David. So that seems to be something that he included, and God, according to verse 25, God permitted it. Now, I don't understand the argument that some try to make where they say that God never approved of mechanical musical instruments in worship. So my question would be, okay, why? What would be the argument? Because I'm looking at it, I'm seeing it, right? I'm seeing that they did do that. Why would you suppose that he never wanted mechanical musical instrument?
It's all in the same sentence right there. But he's saying that the Lord was cymbals, and then he says the command was from the Lord.
Right.
But the worship was the command from the Lord. That is already given to us before. But then now he's including that, and then he goes on and say that that was from David.
Yes, but he puts the command from the Lord. That's what we were just talking about. Some say never, which is the command was just to worship. Except for that statement is put at the end of all that's said there about the instruments. The command that was from David, was from Gad, was from Nathan, the prophets. So they made that statement, and then the command, which command was from the Lord?
He says from the Lord, which is referring to God,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't say God made this command. You know what I mean? About,
Well, if the command is from the Lord, then, no, I don't.
or the Lord is like, you know, in the third present tense. Can you understand what is saying the Lord, like when we talk about the Lord,
Okay, well, let me read this. So he says, and you tie it together with the word command. He then stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with their cymbals, harps, and lyres, according to the command of David, and of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for the command. So the command goes back to the other command, for the command was from the Lord through his prophets. I think it's a difficult thing to try to split it and say, well, that only refers to the command to worship, because it doesn't say that. It doesn't say, you know, he doesn't interject in there, the command from the Lord was only to worship. He puts this part before that statement, and he calls it a command.
okay, like if we say, Ken, he brought his guitar up there, you know, to sing.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, this came from the commandment of the Lord. He's saying that himself. So then, but everybody else, Gad, they all approved of this
Mhm.
symbols and stuff
Mm-hmm.
themselves. But what I'm saying is that the command to worship came from God himself. Then they're adding this on to it. It seems to me like.
But that's not the way it's worded. If it was worded where the command was from God to worship, and then it doesn't even say that. In fact, if you're dealing with David, and not that they can't be fallible, David, Gad, and Nathan, then you're supposing that all three determined that they were just going to disregard what God wanted and command the people to use the instrument, because they call it a command. So these three determined to command the Levites, right, who were God's priests, you're going to use the instruments. Well, with no objection from the Levites, they just said, oh, okay. So, and I'm not saying that's not possible, that they just said, well, we'll just do whatever you want us to do. But if you've got David and you've got a seer Gad and you've got the prophet, if these prophets in essence, saying that, and then when you look at the latter part, he says, for the command was from the Lord through whom? Through his prophets. Well, Nathan is a prophet. And so I just think that if you're going to, the argument, I know what you're saying, and that's the argument I heard before, that it only applies back to the act of worship itself. The problem is the way it's worded would make that very confusing to understand that, because of what he puts prior to that, calls it a command, puts three people in there that would be, would be seeming to be those kind of people who follow God, but then all of a sudden just reject him, which I'm not saying that's not possible, but.
Back to your original question, what is God looking for? Why? Man created the musical instruments, God created man.
Right.
So musical instruments cannot worship God.
Right.
So there's no point there. And also, we know from the New Testament it's supposed to be from the heart. And once again, the musical instrument has no heart.
Right. So, and that's a great point. So what Ken is saying is that the mechanical instrument can't worship God. It's an inanimate object, right? So we are the ones that worship God, and we come before God and we worship him through, as we find in the New Testament, through singing, right?
Not only that, it's not, it is man-made, it is not God-made.
Right.
We are.
Right. So here's the question, though. And those are true statements. So the question then is, why did he allow him to do it? Why did he permit this to happen then? So, and what I try to say is, or try to clarify, is that there's nothing inherently sinful with a mechanical instrument. It's an inanimate object. It doesn't sin. It can't do anything that we don't make it do. It can be used for sinful purposes, right? You can use all sorts of things for sinful purposes. But in and of itself, it is not. The only reason a musical instrument can be used in sinning against God is when it's introduced without the permission of God. And that would be anything, right? So when you go back, and I'm going to use Nadab and Abihu here, but when you go back and look at Leviticus chapter 10, the downfall was what? That they offered to God something he had not commanded. That's what made the act sinful, right? The fire that they used was not sinful in and of itself. It's like, well, you could never, if that fire is sinful, you could never start that fire, you could never have that fire. It's just sinful. Well, you were burning some sinful wood. It's like, well, is wood sinful? Can it be? Well, if God called it, then yes, it would be. So their act was a disobedience to what God had commanded. So the act itself was substituting something. But if God had told them that it didn't matter what fire they offered, then what would have been the argument? If it doesn't matter what fire you offer, then he's giving you permission to use whatever you want. So when you get to this point in time, why would it have been sinful for them to use mechanical instruments in tabernacle worship? Why would that have been sinful? Because he never authorized it. He never told them that they could do that. He never said, use this instrument. The only thing he gave them was a trumpet, and they used that here. And the trumpet was used to make recognition of the sacrifice and a call to worship. That's what it was used for. It wasn't played as a trumpet would be played for musical purposes. It was a sounding, a recognition, right? So if it wasn't used in tabernacle worship, we'd say, well, it couldn't have been used because God didn't authorize them to use it. But when you get over here, you say, okay, God said they could use it here. And he never condemns them for you. You can't go through the entire Old Testament and find where that use of the instrument in temple worship was ever condemned by God. Did God just say, well, I'm not going to say anything about that. I'm just going to let it. This is something that God would know in his foreknowledge, would know that this would become an issue in the church somewhere down the road. And he just took an opportunity to be silent about it when they introduced it in temple worship. He's like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to let them figure this one out for themselves. Or if, in fact, the command is God is allowing them to do that. David wanted it. God didn't design the temple. Initially, that wasn't his desire anyway. He told David what to do, and then he permitted David to do that. And they used it in those particular areas. So I believe that when you're trying to determine the statement, God never allowed it anywhere, my question is why? And Ken is right. Well, in that you could say, God wants us to worship him. But he permits it in temple worship. Why? So rather than me trying to hang up on he never wanted anywhere, I'm saying, well, it seems to me, unless I'm wrong about verse 25, then I haven't seen a good argument why that's not what that means. Then
I'm thinking if the trumpet being used, just like trying to elevate all the worship, just like they use in the synagogue, the shofar. After they pray, they use the shofar, so all the prayer is going to go.
they do the trumpet.
Just like the trumpet.
Well, and when you go back and look at how the trumpet was used, it was either a call to worship to announce it, or in the sacrifices, it was used as a recognition of the glory of, like, kind of elevating what just took place here, but not in a musical way. It wasn't like, let's hit 15 notes and, run a couple of bars and, make a cool little ditty out of this thing. It was just, they blew the trumpet. Very similar to when you see them going to take down the walls of Jericho. They didn't blow a nice ditty when they were they just blew the trumpet, right? Blow it. And that sound of the trumpet was a recognition of the glory of God. These walls are coming down because of God's glory. And so that's how that trumpet was used. And they have that over here in temple, but then they also bring in this instrument part too, so.
Not to get sidetracked, but this kind of reminds me of when they demanded that they have a king. God
Yeah.
didn't want it that way,
But he allowed it.
He allowed it,
Mhm.
knowing that it would bring that, what
Yeah.
but we have free will.
Yeah.
So he said, I'm gonna allow it, this is not how I designed it, and I know this is gonna cause you trouble down the road, but you demanded it, so you're gonna get it.
He's going to let him do it, yeah. Yeah, because, and remember what Samuel, in 1 Samuel, what he was arguing about was that they were rejecting him, right? And God said, no, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as their king. So I'm gonna let them have a king, right? And it's going to be to their downfall. Let me get Bernie and then go back over
How
here.
is this gonna expound on what he said, because I mentioned this to Rick the other night. The Israelites cried out for this, begging God to give them a king,
Right,
because everybody else had a king.
right.
But then he says, well, okay, and then, later on, he repented because he had done that.
Yeah, 'cause after the fact, he realized he did something wrong,
Yeah.
but he'd already done it, he can't ring a bell.
So it's the
Who?
same thing
We-
we're getting into here.
Say that again, what was it?
That God repented of him even allowing them to have a king, because he was the king,
Yeah,
and they started like thinking like David, even though he's a sinner.
well, I think you could use that same argument maybe if that's actually what that word is meaning, is like he regretted ever doing this. I think God, being an omniscient God, regret seems to be a little, our understanding of regret, it's like we regret, but it's like after the fact. There's no after the fact with God because he already knows what the outcome is going to be, right? So he allows it to take place. Sometimes that word regret can be translated as displeased, right? He was displeased with the outcome of what took place. So maybe in what we're seeing there, if you want to align that with this, you get to the New Testament worship, and once again, we don't see the instrument ever being included. So if it follows that same vein of thought where David wanted it, God allowed it, but then God says that old system is done, and maybe it's very possible that was, and I'm not even going to say that because it's just conjecture, but why God allowed it, and then you get to the first century and it's like, well, maybe that's why, because that whole system of worship is gone, including that. Right, including that, and you start fresh. So,
That instruments would be out.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you have the temple, which is a man-made idea.
Right.
And it's not going to be continued on in a physical form.
Right.
You have David wanting to use musical instruments, which is a man-made idea.
Mhm.
It's not going to continue on. You know, the temple worship and musical instruments, to me, is just, you know, not bogus because they were worshiping, but I mean, it was not going to be a permanent thing. It wasn't anything God had ever requested, and he did it, I believe, because of the relationship with David. David wanted to build a temple to honor God. God, as a friend, said, "Go ahead and do it. I don't need it." David wanted to do the musical instruments because there's outpouring love for God. God said, "Go ahead and do it. I understand what it is." But it had nothing to do with what's going to happen. So I think it was just a temporary thing that God allowed in both cases because the temple was temporary. Go ahead and use the musical instruments in a temporary thing that is not going to continue.
Well, if you go back and look at the people of Israel, going back to what Chad had said about the king in 1 Samuel, the same would be true there as well, right? God allowed the kings to reign. It's not what he ever desired. In fact, we know it's not what he desired because in the new covenant, we have a king, Christ, right? That one king. So, and that means any king that was going to be our king is going to be whom? God. God was their king before Saul, right? And David and Solomon and then all the other kings after that. He was their king, was always their king. So in the same way, if you're looking at that vein of thought, he allowed it, but eventually got us to a new covenant where there is one king. God gave them the tabernacle, okay? David wanted a temple. God allowed the temple because there was a day coming when we would be the temple of God. So all those things were going to be, and look, I can't say this in the scripture, but I'm always asking myself, why interject that? Like we know with the law, according to Galatians, why the law then, right? It was added because, so he tells us why. It was added because of transgressions. If the plan of salvation was to be fulfilled through Christ, through the promise to Abraham, why did he even bring the law in? He tells us, okay, why the temple then? He doesn't tell us. He just says that David wanted it. Why the instrument in worship? David wanted it, I suppose. But is there a greater message there? All that stuff was going to be done away anyway. And so is there some other purpose that God allowed those things to happen as a lesson? I don't know. I just know that they were there for a moment and now they're gone. They're not part of God's worship any longer. So whatever purpose God may have had for them is, if it's just because he was trying to allow David to show his love for him in those ways, if that's what it was, whatever it was a temporary thing. It wasn't something that God had ordered them to do when he did the tabernacle. And when we get to the New Testament, it's not something he commands us to do under the New Testament.
Yeah, we are a God-made temple.
Right.
That was a
Human-made temple. Yeah. Well, and what was the tabernacle? It was God's design. Yeah. Man put his hand to it, but God was the one who actually told him what to do with it and how to do everything, right? All that worship was his design.
It's actually kind of interesting when you look at the New Testament and it talks about the old being nailed to the cross. You have the new, they talk about the will and testament.
Right.
With the will and testament, that might have components of the old one, but they don't have the New Testament and then refer back to the old one and add to the new one.
Right.
They say this new one, although it may have similarities, this is what
It's a new-
we follow at the new one.
Yeah.
Even though there might be similarities, we can't go, oh, but on the old one it said this, we're gonna bring it into the new one.
Right.
That new one is sacrifice.
New, yeah.
We have to follow. So nailing the old one to the cross, we get to know God, but what he commanded in the old and what is new are two totally different things.
Well, I don't think it would be any different than going from everybody prior to Moses and then coming into this covenant that was given to Moses. What was their worship like all prior to that? That kind of worship, although there may have been things that were integrated. There was the priest, right? We go back and look at Abraham, and Abraham had offered to Melchizedek, so we had a high priest there. We had the king. You see similarities to it, but then it just takes on a whole new form in how it's done with an actual a place that they carried with them. We don't ever see anybody from the Garden of Eden all the way down to Moses ever doing that. So, all right, take a look over in Genesis in chapter 4. So going back prior to Moses, during the patriarchal age, we do not have a mention of the use of musical instrument in worshiping God. And we'll say this, it's not because they didn't have instruments. I've heard people make that argument. Well, you know, they just didn't have instruments way back then. They were living in caves and they didn't have instruments. Well, that's not correct. In chapter 4 and verse 21, his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who played the lyre and the pipe. And then look down in 31 through, let me get over here. I think it's in chapter 31. Go to chapter 31. 421. So in 421, in the lineage through Adam, right, his family, we have the mention of Jubal, and he says his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who played the lyre and the pipe. Now, saying the father of doesn't necessarily mean he was the one doing it, but he's the father of those who did. In all likelihood, that statement is making reference to as a passed on craft, right? He passed this on to his children. Or though it could just make reference to later on when you find all these people who are playing the lyre and the harp, then this was their father. But I think there's a greater connection there. In 31 in verse, go ahead, Ken.
George Washington's called the father of the country because he really started it, and I believe that's the same.
Very similar, yeah. I would think so too. All right, in 31 verse 27, why did you flee secretly and deceive me and did not tell me that I might have sent you away with joy, with song, with the timbrel, and with a lyre? So forth. So if you go through and you're reading the Old Testament, you're not going to find her in the beginning before we get to Moses. You're going to find people that had instruments, right? It was something that they used and participated in. And so it's not something that they didn't possess. The question then is, they possessed them, but we never see them using them in worship, in any kind of worship that we have in the patriarchal age. So if I go back and I'm looking at Adam and Eve, I'm going down to Noah, going down to the tower, Babel, going to Abraham, moving into Isaac and Esau and Jacob, and then we finally get into the captivity. All those years, we don't see, with 2,000 years, we don't see a mention of them using a mechanical instrument in worship. In fact, the mention of their worship is very sparse. What they actually did is not really detailed in great effect.
Did David use the harp in worshiping God?
So when we see David playing the harp, initially he's introduced in 1 Samuel as one who played the harp, but he played it. It was just that it just says that he was a musician, right? He played the instrument. But Saul then, when his kingdom is taken away from him, has an evil spirit from the Lord. And so they were told of David, he was told of David, and so David would come and play the harp, and when David would play the harp, it would calm down Saul. That's where we see the initial act of David using the instrument, was either in a private setting that he just played it, didn't go into detail what he did with it, but then when he's playing for Saul to keep Saul from losing his mind. So other than that, we don't see him taking into an act of worship, and that's, in the time of the law itself, right? We don't see it being used there. So, all right, so following the patriarchal age, and we're going to move into the time of Moses. This closes out the book of Genesis, and then we're beginning with the book of Exodus. The first time you're going to see the use of a musical instrument in any type of worship to God, and we're not talking about something that God ordained as a worship, but something that the people chose to do, is Exodus 15. So get over Exodus 15. So they cross over the Red Sea. It's been divided, right? And then verse 30 of chapter 14. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. And Moses and the sons of Israel, this is chapter 15, sang this song to the Lord and said, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. So they begin to sing, and this would be an act of praise, right? They're praising God in this act. Get down to verse 20. Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took the timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out with her with timbrels and with dancing. Miriam answered, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his riders he has hurled into the sea. So we see Miriam taking the timbrel and dancing with these other people and bringing that in what would be considered to them, I would suppose, an act of worship to God. They're praising him and using this. Now, this was not something that God had commanded. It was not something that they'd just come out of Egypt. They've been distant from God for a long period of time. And we know that when they came out of Egypt, they had a lot of ideas in their head that were Egyptian, right? That's where they were enslaved. So coming out and doing this, if you're going to use this as an argument for God approves of them using the instrument in worship, because look what Miriam did, then, and I know some people will say amen to this, then he approves of you dancing in worship as well, because they were also doing that as an act of worship to God. And granted, you'll find congregations out there that say, that's why we dance all over the place, because we're so overjoyed that we're going to dance and we're going to shake the timbrel. And
I think one of the reasons they're so adamant about this being the first time is because she was a prophetess, and she took the
right,
She's still human. She
right.
still chose to do it. It doesn't say God commanded her to do it. She happened to be a prophetess that picked it up. It didn't say that he told her to.
Well, but you can also make that same argument then going back to what we said with David and Gad and Nathan. They're also David the prophet, Nathan's a prophet. So although he's a prophet, he could have just chose to add this himself, right? So you can make the same argument there. The only reason I bring this up is this is the first time that we see something like this. They have not been given any commands on how to worship God at this point in time, right? They don't have those instructions. We're not at Mount Sinai. We're not at the Ten Commandments. We're not at the tabernacle. None of that has transpired yet. They just come out of Egypt. So this in itself, I would not gravitate to this as being a verse that you should yank out of the Old Testament and throw up into the New Testament and say, well, look, Miriam, she was a prophetess and she did it, so that must make it okay. Well, I can tell you a lot of things that prophets did that were not okay by God, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to say that, but certainly I don't think there's any weight to the argument that because she did that when they crossed the Red Sea, then God approves of that. Especially when you get to the tabernacle worship, and he doesn't include the timbrel, and he doesn't include the dancing, and he doesn't include the lyre, and he doesn't include the harp, and he doesn't include the flute, and the guitar, and the drums, and the banjo, and whatever else you want to throw in there. He doesn't include any of those things. So if we're looking at the law that he gives them, that which they are going to be beholden to as a way of living faithful to God, in that law, which does come after this point in time, that's never in there. So I cannot take this passage and somehow try to interject it into being, no, certainly that God will be okay with it, because look what Miriam did. She was a prophetess and she did this, and they were dancing, so God must approve of that. I would say this, that if God approved of that, he approved of it in that moment, in that occasion, and that was outside of any kind of worship he had told them to do. So if you want to go out there in your house or whatever and shake that, that timbrel and dance around a little bit, if you want to use it for that argument, go ahead. But when you get to the command of worship under the old law, it's not there. So you can't argue it there. I would love to see those same people go, well, if you take a look at the law of Moses, what? What about the law of Moses? Well, when God gave them the tabernacle, yes, he didn't include dancing or the timbrel there. Okay, so why are you going to argue it's okay then? Why would you do that? Well, if you get over to the temple, exactly. But now we've moved out of tabernacle, now we're in temple worship. And will David use the instrument? Yes, by the command of whom? The Lord. So then God approved it over there. So until you have that command, remember that's we go back to the beginning of this lesson, it's the idea of a divine warrant. Unless God authorizes it as an act of worship, we should not be teaching it as such. We should not support it. God's perfectly fine with this. That's why I wouldn't take this and support it as an act of worship that God approves of, because we have no indication of either of that. That it's either them worshiping God in the way that he instructed. They just took this upon themselves, and they did it. They were excited. They were praising God. I get that. But we don't have any support that God said, I wanted them to do this. And I'm not saying he was disapproving of it. I can't say that. But it's outside of what becomes the law of their worship. It's not even part of that yet.
Is there any specific instruction from God as far as not using instruments, period, or dance for worshiping?
So, and we'll stop with this here. We got a couple of minutes here. So when we're looking at what God wants us to do, right? If you go back to the old law and look at the instructions, he tells them what they're supposed to be doing, right? So we're going to go back and we can look at the law itself, the 10 Commandments. We can look at the laws for the Levitical priesthood. We can look at the building of the tabernacle, even the garments that the priests wore. We can look at the altar of incense, the table of showbread, the candelabra, the candlestick, what was in the Holy of Holies. All of that was designed never apart from what God commanded them to do. There was never a part where even the measurements, it wasn't like, I think it's a little bit too big, too heavy for us to carry. Let's shorten it up a little bit. In fact, they are warned time and again, do it exactly as you saw, right? So they couldn't vary from that. So God tells them what to do. That is a law of exclusion, right? So, and I'll give you an illustration for this. Your mom tells you, Jacob, go play in the backyard. She's tired of you running around the house. Go play in the backyard. Ah, fine, you got in the backyard. 10 minutes later, your mom looks out the window. You're not in the backyard. You're in the front yard. She goes, what are you doing in the front yard? And you're like, well, you didn't tell me I couldn't come in the front yard. She says, well, I told you to go in the backyard. I know, but you didn't tell me I couldn't come in the front yard. Okay, so mom says, Jacob, play in the backyard. Do not play in the front yard. Okay, she goes back in the house. 10 minutes later, she looks out. You're in the street. She's like, Jacob, what are you doing in the street? I told you to play in the backyard. And you say, well, you didn't say I couldn't play in the street. She said, I told you not to go in the front yard. And you're like, this isn't the front yard. This is the street, Mom. So what would happen is God would have to give you a massive list of what not to do. Instead, he simply says what? This is what to do. When he tells you what to do, the law of exclusion then, when it's specific. So when it comes to music, in the tabernacle worship, God was silent on the instrument, which meant they couldn't just make one up if they wanted to. When we get to the tabernacle, the argument is still the same. Because the command was from God, then they could include that in tabernacle worship or temple worship because God authorized them to do that. When we get to the New Testament, the command is always the same. Sing. Sing. And that word sing is never including the accompaniment of a musical instrument. It never includes that. It's just sing. So if God tells us to sing, you say, well, why can't I sing and play an instrument? Because those are two different kinds of music. There's vocal music and there's instrumental music, right? I can sing without the instrument and I can play without singing. When you bring them together, you're bringing in two different kinds of music. What was the music that God commanded? He commanded vocal music, sing. So that excludes any other kind of music. He doesn't give us authority to use anything else. And if I can't go in there and point you to book, chapter, and verse where God said, this is okay, then, and the typical argument is to jump back to the Old Testament, but then the argument is, well, the Old Testament was nailed to the cross. We're in a new covenant. That's right. There's things that, how much under the old law that we don't do today? It's like, well, why don't you do that? Why don't you sacrifice animals? Why don't you take the showbread? Why don't you have the Levitical priesthood? Aaron, why don't you have that anymore? Well, we have a priesthood. Christ is our high priest. We're his priests. We take the communion. He's changed things to a new covenant. And under that new covenant, like tabernacle worship, and this is my favorite argument, new covenant worship is likened to tabernacle worship, not temple worship. The tabernacle was the shadow of what was to come. The substance is the church. The shadow was the tabernacle worship. So if you look at tabernacle worship and you never see instruments in it, and the substance is New Testament worship, why would you suppose you'd find it here? Because that shadow is reflecting this, the real thing, right? And if that shadow is not reflecting an instrument, then the real thing doesn't have one there to be reflected. The temple was in between that. It's a different thing. So God tells us what to do, and we do it. All right, well, we're going to look some more into this next week in regards to the instruments that we find under the old law. And I'm going to bring up, this is actually interesting here with the ISBE, which is the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. They're very clear that if you go back and as much as people think that the Old Testament was full of musical worship, it wasn't. It was not. It wasn't like just every place you look, somebody was playing an instrument in God's worship. In fact, it was a very scarce thing. It wasn't a big issue to them to include musical instrument. And the one place that you never find a musical instrument being used in Jewish worship was the synagogue. And that's interesting. Why? Because the synagogue is man's design. When the Jews decided to set up the synagogue, because they couldn't get to the temple, when they set up the synagogue, why is it that they chose not to include the instrument that was being used in the temple? There's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that next week. All right.